Welcome back. Honestman, Skyrim, here to evaluate the 18 skill trees. Now, before we dive in, a few thoughts and disclaimers. First off, I'm going to be evaluating these skills and perks within the context of what I consider optimal. That might sound highly subjective, and I concede that certain aspects definitely are subjective. However, if we're talking about an objective critique of the game's balance, then I think it strongly favors weapons-based damage in the end game. I don't think it's controversial for me to assert that the end game damage potential of martial fighters far exceeds the end game damage potential of mages. We have the numbers to back that up. As such, I don't think it's unreasonable for me to say that if we're talking about a quote-unquote optimal endgame setup, then we're talking about a martial combatant, not a mage. So that's going to be the primary focus of this analysis. I will have some comments related to mage builds here, but if you really crave mage talk, then I'm going to have a separate video dedicated to that topic. My second disclaimer is that this analysis is based on the default difficulty setting. I understand that the relative strengths and merits of certain skills and certain strategies shifts as we change the difficulty setting, especially for things like illusion and conjuration. I understand that. My focus here, however, is the adept difficulty level, which is the default difficulty. Third, the rule of fun is always in play, right? I'm not here to tell you that your fun is wrong. If you think using two-handed weapons is fun, by God, do it. And for the record, I think using two-handed weapons is fun as well, but I am going to talk some trash from a mechanics perspective about two-handed weapons. Similarly, mages. I think my mage builds have been the funnest builds, perhaps. But again, it's not really optimal if we're talking end game, which is to say high character levels. So all of this is to say that no matter which direction I sort of lean with this analysis, you do you. You can absolutely do sort of whatever you want, but I think the best guidance that I can give you is try to stay as focused as possible. The enemies in Skyrim scale with your character level. There's an upper bound to that, but it's true nonetheless. So if you bloat your character level with non-combat skills or a very wide variety of combat skills, you're going to be pretty ineffective and you're going to be feeling some crunch. So that's the warning. I think you can be very successful doing almost anything as long as you're not trying to do everything. All that said, let's dive into some skills. First up is illusion, and I don't think illusion brings much to the table. If you like the idea of having enemies fight each other, then illusion can be good for that, especially in the early game. Ultimately, though, I'd rather just take out enemies myself directly, especially at higher levels where you start to overcome the power curve. As for spells, invisibility is a great illusion spell, but the problem is that by the time you get it, and by the time you can actually cast it, you probably don't even need it anymore. So if you're really hooked on the idea of invisibility, then I would argue that Alchemy would actually be a much more effective way of enabling it, by way of invisibility potions. So bottom line for me, I would not recommend any points into illusion. Even if you're looking at it from the perspective of a mage build, if you want to play this sort of crowd control indirect damage game, then Conjuration is a much stronger pick because nothing is immune to Conjuration, whereas there are enemies that are immune to illusion's tricks. Of course, Master of the Mind here allows us to negate those immunities, but this is skill level 90, which is a complete joke. Like, this is way too late to be feasible as far as I'm concerned, because these are not uncommon enemy types. Daedra are rare, so that's kind of moot, but undead and automatons are extremely common. So if you're pushing into illusion as sort of a core combat strategy and you can't use it against undead and automatons, that's just a non-starter as far as I'm concerned. Now, hypothetically, if it's a very large group and immunity isn't a problem, then I could see the case that illusion would be superior to conjuration. But again, immunity is a problem, and also very large groups are extremely rare. So again, if I'm a mage looking for like an indirect controller sort of skill, I'd go conjuration. And if you're a martial fighter, I don't think there's really anything here for you. Speaking of conjuration, as I just said, it's very similar to illusion in that it presents some good crowd control options, except it doesn't have the limitations of illusion in that role. So I'm pretty confident saying that conjuration is superior to illusion if your goal is to even the odds against a modest group of enemies. That said, an endgame martial fighter doesn't need crowd control, so conjuration doesn't really have much value. Now, if you like the idea of conjuration but don't want to invest, then you can keep it relevant through the mid-game with tools like the Sanguine Rose Staff, which is a Daedric item that summons Jermora, or Summon Spectral Assassin, which is a Dark Brotherhood reward. So you can bring these sort of summons to the battlefield without it technically being conjuration, but it's the same sort of gameplay. Ultimately, I would not recommend any points into conjuration unless you are all in on a mage build that's going to use it as their primary combat strategy. Jumping over to restoration. Restoration is trash. I'm pretty comfortable saying that, just categorically. It's not worth investing in. Restoration's Day in the Sun was back when the Necromage perk buffed vampires, but that was clearly a bug, which was subsequently rightly squashed by the unofficial patch mod. The only other thing that jumps out is the Recovery perk, which increases Magicka regeneration. That's something that might be tempting for mage builds, but I think it's a trap that isn't worth the investment because in the early game, I don't think it makes sense to dilute your character level with non-combat skills. And then when you get to the point where you might have some spare perk points to use, that's probably also the point where you should be crafting your endgame gear anyway, at which point your mana pool should basically be irrelevant. Now, I think a sort of middle ground position would be to take Restoration just to 30, and then sink 2 perk points, one into Novice Restoration just to get us going here, and then the second perk point into the first tier of Recovery, which is plus 25% regeneration. That said, I can't condone even the middle ground position. I think even those 2 perk points and the additional skill levels, although modest, into Restoration would be a waste. I would not put any points into Restoration unless you're trying to play an actual, like, quote-unquote healer, and Restoration is going to be your primary skill. Alteration. In terms of spells, Paralysis is really strong, but what's even stronger is just killing something. Alteration also has some useful utility spells, but nothing that requires any investment into the skill tree. Mages might raise an eyebrow at skills like Mage Armor, Stability, and Atronach, but don't. Those are traps. They're traps because, number one, you shouldn't be getting hit in the first place, so Mage Armor is pointless. Number two, if you're a Destruction Mage, you're going to be wearing a heavy armor headpiece to boost your damage output, and that's going to eliminate the benefit of Mage Armor anyway. And number three, you're fundamentally inflating your character level with a non-combat skill, which is going to make you weaker relative to the game's power curve. So pushing deep into Alteration is actually counterproductive. Ironically, Alteration is better for martial fighters than for mages, because martial fighters are probably going to be stretched thin on armor enchantments, so they'll really want the magic resistance that's available here to help hit the 85% magic resistance cap. In addition, martial fighters basically break the power curve in the endgame, so they don't have to worry about pushing deep into non-combat skills when they are finalizing their build. So I think all non-mage builds should plan for at least 5 points into Alteration in order to get magic resistance, which is a grand total 30% resistance, which is excellent. Certainly the stretch goal could be 8 points total, which would get you both the resistance as well as magic absorption from Atronach, just for defensive purposes. But I don't consider the absorption to be a part of my core build. Quite frankly, once you're maxed on magic resistance and have elemental resistances to back it up, you're going to be practically invincible, so adding spell absorption on top is just sort of overkill. Next is Destruction. I'm going to defer to my mage episode where I'm going to take a deeper dive into the Destruction skill tree, specifically within the context of mage builds. For now, for martial builds, I would suggest at least 7 points into Destruction so that you can fully augment all 3 elements. As you can see here, we can augment Shock, Frost, and Fire, plus 50% for all 3, which requires skill level 60. The reason this is desirable is because the augmentation perks here affect weapon enchantments. So definitely keep that in mind. For end game build, you're almost certainly looking at Chaos. Chaos is a weapon enchantment that does elemental damage of all 3 elements. So this is going to bolster your Chaos enchantments. And even prior to that point, whatever Fire, Frost, Shock enchantments you happen to have at your disposal. Which is maybe a good segue over to Enchantment. Enchantment is one of the most important skills in the game. I think literally everyone should be investing in Enchantment. It's only a question of when. Mages and or folks who want to use Enchanting as a cash cow could make Enchantment an early priority, relatively speaking. Martial builds can wait all the way until the end game and push Enchantment all at once. In all cases, you'll ultimately want to max out Enchanter, which is the first level here, 5 points there. You'll also want Insightful Enchanter, which improves skill enchantments. And you'll want the Capstone perk Extra Effect, which allows you to apply 2 enchantments per item instead of just 1. I think most people are going to want the Shock, Ice, and Fire Enchanter perks as well. And then Corpus Enchanter is an option which affects hit points, magicka, and stamina. You could possibly skip this depending on which enchantments you're targeting. But I'm just going to go ahead and pencil it in. So in total, I think everyone should plan on 10 to 11 points into enchantment. The good news is that all of those points could be completely refunded after your end game crafting is complete. Smithing is another important skill, but with the caveat that pure mages who wear cloth and don't wield martial weapons should probably skip smithing entirely. For everyone else, you're almost certainly going to want Arcane Blacksmith, which is skill level 60 right in the middle, which allows you to improve enchanted weapons and armor. And you're going to want some combination of Dragon Smithing and Ebony Smithing, depending on which weapons you're after. Ebony Smithing actually being for Stalrim weapons. Armors are also a consideration, but the fact that you can buff basically anything to the armor cap means that in the end game, armor is mostly a matter of taste and convenience. For my purposes, I'm planning on everything in the smithing tree except for Daedric, so 9 points total. Just like with enchantment, you can get all of those points back after you finish crafting your final equipment. Next up is heavy armor. Heavy armor is trash. The number one thing that it has going for it is the higher armor value relative to light armor. But as I just mentioned, you can hit the armor cap with basically any armor in the game, light or heavy. So in the end game, armor value shouldn't be a deciding factor. In addition, heavy armor makes it harder to sneak because it makes more noise, and it also slows down your movement. Now, the movement penalty can be negated by investing 4 points on the left-hand side here to get up to conditioning, and the sneak penalty can be negated with deep investment into the sneak skill tree. But I think light armor is still just a much better value proposition. Light armor does slow you down compared to wearing cloth, but not as much as heavy armor. And just like heavy armor, the movement penalty can be negated by investing in the tree. It's much earlier in the tree, however. We only need 3 points, and it's at skill level 50. In addition, you can get a 50% boost to stamina regeneration with Windwalker. That's the big perk here. Heavy armor doesn't have anything as good as this in my view. So I think this is what really makes light armor the better value. The big downside to light armor, if you can even call it a downside, is the lower armor ratings compared to heavy. But again, that's just a short-term problem. Ultimately, I'd always favor light armor over heavy armor, and I'd recommend 4 points into light armor in order to get to the movement and stamina regen perks. Depending on your end game armor selections, an additional point or 2 into Agile Defender may be necessary to hit the armor cap. I think that's unlikely unless you're going with like really low grade stuff because you like the appearance of it, but I do want to put that out there nonetheless. For my purposes and my experience, I'm usually running Dragon Scale for gloves and boots, and then Savior's Hide for chest. That's usually plenty to get me up to the armor cap with only 1 point invested in Agile Defender. Now, before we move on to weapons, I want to try to clarify the topic of movement speed and armor. I've searched, and there's precious little hard data on this topic. That said, equipping a bunch of heavy armor absolutely does lower your movement speed. That's a fact. It's also a fact, however, that it's not a binary. If you just equip a heavy helmet, for example, and everything else is either cloth or light armor, then you might not notice any change at all to your movement speed. From my own experience in testing, the movement penalties, and there are multiple degrees of severity, seem to correspond with certain weight thresholds. As long as the total weight of all of your equipped armor is within a particular threshold, then there won't be any movement penalty. That's my hypothesis, which seems to explain what I've observed. If someone else has a better hypothesis, or if someone is able to unveil the sort of black and white facts of exactly what's going on in the code, I'd love to hear it. I've also heard speculation that Skyrim uses the same system as Oblivion for movement speed, but there's absolutely no evidence that I'm aware of that confirms or proves that assertion. Regardless, my message is that you can mix and match light, heavy, and cloth, and it may or may not affect your movement speed. In general, I don't recommend doing that though, because you're spreading yourself across multiple skill trees and eliminating the value of Windwalker, but it can hypothetically be done. Now, on to some weapons. Two-handed weapons are awful. So I switched over to my two-handed character here, Grog, to talk about this topic and sort of evidence the fact that I'm speaking from some experience here. The fundamental problem, particularly in the end game, is that you're sacrificing a piece of equipment, which means you're sacrificing 2 enchantments. And in return, you're getting a weapon that swings slower than any of the one-handed options. The trade is supposed to be that you're doing more damage, but that just ends up being an awful trade because it doesn't offset the loss of enchantments. Ultimately, if the goal is to kill things quickly, particularly in melee, then one-handed options are actually the best way to do that. Now, the developers could fix this by creating a perk that does one of 2 things. Either double enchantment potency on two-handed weapons, or double the number of enchantments that can be applied to two-handed weapons. Then you're at least breaking even with dual-wield builds on enchantments. You're still swinging significantly slower, but if you get the sweep perk, which lets you hit multiple targets, then maybe you're coming out ahead against groups. Either way, I think it would create an interesting decision for the player, and it'd make two-handed weapons much more competitive with single-handed weapons in the end game. Again, the caveat is end game. That's all hypothetical, though. With the current state of affairs, I would not recommend two-handed weapons. Now, again, back to my disclaimers at the top. If you like using two-handed weapons, go ahead and use two-handed weapons. Just understand the trade that you're making. If, for whatever reason, you do want to do a two-handed build, which I actually would recommend, it's really fun. But if you do, you obviously want to max Barbarian. I think Champion Stance is great, and Devastating Blow. those would be the 3 perks. I think that's 7 points total. I think you're in really good shape there. Sweep, I think, looks great on paper. Sideways power attacks allows you to hit all targets in front of you. In practice, I just don't think this comes up often enough. I mean, you'd think it would, but just speaking from experience, it kind of doesn't. So your mileage may vary. As for the weapon-specific perks, Limb Splitter, Deep Wounds, and Skull Crusher, I'll dip into their equivalents when I talk about one-handed. The other note that I'll put out there in regards to two-handed builds is go ahead and get Wuthrod as soon as you can. I'm going to be having an optimized playthrough coming soon, and one of the things that I'm going to suggest there is to go through the Companion's questline as soon as possible. And there's a whole bunch of benefits to that, but especially for two-handed builds, you can get the Wuthrod axe at the end of that questline. This is an amazing axe, prior to doing your end game. This is awesome. So try to get to that. It's going to give you a 20% bonus against elven races. But the more important part, perhaps, is just the base strength. I think it has the base strength that's commensurate with Dragonbone. So if you get this at like level 9, you're in great shape, which is basically what happened with this playthrough. For one-handed weapons, I'd suggest maxing Armsman, which is our first level damage boost here. So 5 points into there. And that's pretty much it. Fighting Stance and Savage Strike can be worth it, but I just wouldn't recommend them because I think those points are better put elsewhere. And by the time you have the points to spare, it just doesn't matter anymore. And what I mean by that is, by the time you have the points to spare, you should be into endgame, have your endgame gear, and everything's basically dying in 1 or 2 hits anyway. So these are sort of moot at that point. Now, if you're trying to do a very focused martial build, and the two-handed build that I just showed was an example of that. I did 0 archery. It was all two-handed. If you're doing that here with one-handed, then I can see putting additional points in and gobbling up Fighting Stance and Savage Strike and getting good value there. But short of that, I think you're going to be spread too thin, because ultimately what I would advocate for is you want both a melee weapon and a bow. Your mileage may vary, of course, but that's sort of my justification for saying that. Now, looking at some of these other abilities, Hack and Slash gives you bleed damage with an axe. Bonebreaker lets you ignore armor with a mace. And Bladesman gives you bonus crit damage with swords. Two-handed has comparable selections, as I mentioned earlier. I think these all suck. The reason that they do is because, one, there are enemies that are immune to bleed. Right? So this is only situationally useful. For ignoring armor, well, not everything has armor. Dragons, most notably, do not have any armor. So Bonebreaker does nothing against a dragon. That said, enemies who do have armor, this actually is very effective, but it's just too situational for my tastes. Bladesman might seem like the best all-around choice because it's going to be enemy agnostic, but this is a poor value because the damage that it adds is in relation to the base strength of your weapon. So as an example, I have my Dragonbane sword here, which at this point happens to be 405 damage based on crafting it as well as whatever enchantments I have in play. The bonus critical damage from Bladesman does not use the 405. It uses the base strength of this weapon, which I believe is 14 damage. So that doesn't scale, right? In the early game, it's noticeable. It very quickly falls off, and it's just not worth it. So in short, I think the weapon-specific perks are all traps. I wouldn't recommend any of them. Before I move on, I have to talk about dual wielding. Now, obviously the big draw to dual wielding, or the big argument, I suppose, is, well, it's more damage per second. And I get that, but the problem is that with endgame gear, enemies are going to die fast regardless. Like, they're going to be dead in 1 or 2 hits regardless. And whether it's early, mid, or late game, I'd just much rather have a shield in that hand so I can bring some defensive enchantments to bear and so that I can power bash. I think that's just a better balance of kill fast and hard to kill compared to dual wielding. Now that said, the rule of fun still applies, and everything I said about two-handed applies here as well with dual wielding. If you think it's a fun concept and you want to go in on it, do it. Obviously, in that case, you want to go into dual flurry as well as up here to dual savagery. And of course, the assumption being we're talking about a very focused build, you would also push into fighting stance and savage strike. Now, this is a very stamina-hungry build. When you do that two-handed power strike, which hits 3 times, you burn through a ton of stamina. The good news is that in order to do a power attack, you actually only need 1 stamina. You just need your stamina to not be 0. So the pro tip is that you want to get into cooking. There's a very small number of foods that you can cook, which will regenerate your stamina over time. It'll constantly be ticking up. So you just eat one of those foods going into a big combat, and you basically don't have to worry about your stamina. You can more or less do unlimited power attacks. So give that a try if you are tapping out on stamina. Now, using a bow, just like with using a two-handed melee weapon, means you are sacrificing 2 enchantments. Right? You're occupying both hands with 1 piece of equipment instead of having equipment in each hand. That said, the fact that we're talking about ranged instead of melee, I think makes all the difference. So when we are looking at archery, I think it could have a place in virtually every build, unless you're foregoing martial combat entirely, or just foregoing the bow specifically. And I just showed 2 examples of that, my two-handed build as well as my dual wield build. Neither one of those used the bow even once. So it can be done, it can be fun, but I still think if we're trying to look at this sort of through the objective lens of optimal and not like just artificially making the game harder for yourself, I think having a bow is just a tremendous advantage. Being able to operate effectively at range and oftentimes maintaining the element of stealth and or surprise while doing so is just a huge tactical advantage. For my money, I want at least 10 points into archery. I want to max overdraw, which is 5 points. I want to zoom in with Eagle Eye. I want to slow time with Steady Hands. I want Power Shot for the chance to stagger. And I want Quick Shot for faster draw speed. The cherry on top would be going through Critical Shot to get to Ranger here, which allows you to move faster while having the bow drawn. But that's not really my style. My style is to switch to melee if things get messy, not to continue to try to move and strafe with the bow in close quarters. Blocking, not to be confused with shield, right? Because many of the blocking perks apply to two-handed weapons in addition to shields. This also depends a lot on playstyle. As I mentioned earlier, I like having a shield to pair with my one-handed weapon so that I can use some defensive enchantments, but the blocking perks provide shields with even more utility. First and foremost, I think Power Bash is awesome, especially in the early game, but also holding up basically all the way through endgame. It lets you stun most enemies, which is game-changing. So I do 1 point into Shield Wall just to get over to Power Bash. Quick Reflexes, which slows down time when an enemy is power attacking you, can be good, especially early, but my personal opinion is that it isn't quite good enough. For me, I think the play is 2 points into block, 1 into Shield Wall, and then just get over into Power Bash, and that's it. And do note that this only requires skill level 30, which I think is the sweet spot. I would not go out of your way to try to skill up block higher than 30, at least not prior to endgame. Getting over into our thief skills, sneak can be tremendously useful. I don't think I need to elaborate too much on how good stealth can be in terms of combat effectiveness or just avoiding combat altogether. That said, I can certainly imagine builds that don't care about stealth at all, and mage builds definitely can and often should fall into that category. Martial builds, however, can derive tremendous value from sneak. We can increase our damage with the right-hand side of the tree, our sneak attacks. Backstab here affecting one-handed weapons, and deadly aim affecting bows. I definitely want both of those in my build, so that's 3 points to get up that side of the tree, and then to help turn those sneak attack opportunities into a reality, we want to max stealth, a full 5 points here. Anyone using armor should consider muffled movement, but do note that enchanting muffle onto a pair of boots is actually superior to the 50% effect from muffled movement. Past that, it's several points before you can get up to silence. Silence is great because it's equivalent to that 100% muffle enchantment that I just mentioned. In other words, you can free up an enchantment slot in exchange for some perk points. I can understand how some people would have called that a bad trade back when there was a level cap, but now, without any limit on perk points, I think it's an excellent deal. For me, I want those perks, at least up to silence. That's part of my core build. That brings the total all the way up to 12 perk points into sneak. How you get there is pretty flexible though. In the early and mid game, it's pretty easy to get a pair of boots with muffle on them. I'm alluding specifically to the Dark Brotherhood here. So my recommendation is to get those boots and then just focus on the right-hand side of the tree first. Then, when you're ready to start transitioning into the late game and have some perk points to spare, that's when I push into the left-hand side all the way up to silence. Speech is another skill that's basically awful and you shouldn't invest anything into it. Persuasion attempts, one, usually aren't that difficult if you're putting any effort whatsoever into carrying speech-boosting items and or potions. And two, they just aren't that impactful, and you virtually always have alternatives like bribing. So ultimately, speech relates to money, since it affects buying and selling prices, but money is a very short-term problem in Skyrim. There are certain perks that might look tempting, like investing here, which increases the cap for a vendor, or fencing, which lets you sell stolen goods. But I think those are traps. Unless you have some aversion to the Thieves Guild, the answer is to just go through the Thieves Guild quests. Then you'll be able to sell stolen goods, and you'll have a collection of merchants with much more gold than your run-of-the-mill Whiterun trader. In short, as I said, I would not invest any points into speech. The third and final crafting skill is Alchemy. Alchemy is probably the single most profitable moneymaker in the game. You certainly don't need to use it for that purpose, but just be aware that there's a lot of money to be made if you invest in Alchemy. For top-end, end-game crafting, you want to plan 7 points into Alchemy, 5 points into Alchemist, and then 2 points to get to Benefactor, going through Physician. If you only care about end-game crafting, then you can completely ignore Alchemy all the way until you're ready to make your final set of equipment, and then max it all in one go. Unlike enchantment and smithing, however, there's a bit of value in keeping points in Alchemy after your endgame equipment. Specifically, we have Snakeblood up here, which provides 50% resistance to poison. The problem is that it's a minimum of 5 points to get there, which is sort of a questionable value proposition. But if we're talking endgame, perk points aren't really a limiting factor for martial builds, so just be aware of Snakeblood. Lockpicking is another bad skill that you shouldn't put any points into. You can pick any lock in the game with 0 investment into this tree. Furthermore, I honestly can't even notice the difference between 15 lockpicking and 100 lockpicking. I'm not saying that there isn't one, I'm just saying I can't really notice it. Now, an interesting characteristic of this tree is that it has some perks that will persist after you legendary the skill. I think the problem is that by the time you're ready to legendary, the perks in question don't actually provide a benefit anymore. Specifically, we're talking about Golden Touch, which increases gold, and we are talking about Treasure Hunter, which is a 50% greater chance of finding special treasure. Both of those are permanent effects that don't go away if you reset the tree, so you could drop 5 points and then immediately legendary the skill if you like. For me, at that point in the game, money and treasure aren't relevant anymore, so I just don't bother. In the end, I don't recommend any points into lockpicking. Last but not least is Pickpocket. Pickpocket is very tricky to evaluate, which is why I saved it for the end. As I mentioned when I discussed speech, gold is a short-term problem. Money is tight early, but meaningless late. So you might think about using Pickpocket early to help pad your wallet and or steal money back from trainers, but it's a trap. Pickpocket levels up very quickly, so using it a lot in the early game is going to skyrocket your Pickpocket level, which is bad because that's going to inflate your character level with a skill that doesn't improve your combat effectiveness. All things considered, I'd suggest some combination of 3 strategies for Pickpocket. Number 1, ignore it. Don't use it. Number 2, use it to steal your money back from trainers, but do so strategically, which is to say, limit how much you use it. I'm going to try to demonstrate this approach in my optimized playthrough coming soon. Or strategy number 3, if you really feel like this is core to your build and core to your concept, you can lean heavily into pickpocketing if you like, which almost certainly means stealing money from trainers, but I'd suggest being really disciplined about focusing on combat relevant training first to help offset the non-combat levels you're going to be getting from Pickpocket. In addition, I would suggest not legendarying Pickpocket when you hit 100. At least not until you're into the end game and after you've basically crushed the game's power curve. As for perks, for the first 2 strategies that I just mentioned, I would not recommend any perks. For the third strategy, if you really want to go all in on pickpocketing, I'd suggest 3 points to get you up to cut purse, which makes gold easier to steal. And then you'd have the option of putting additional points into light fingers if desired. Alchemy and enchanting are a big part of the equation here, because if you enchant really powerful pickpocketing gear, and you combine that with really powerful pickpocketing potions, you can very easily steal thousands in gold without any points into pickpocketing whatsoever. But at that point, we're talking about 3 very high non-combat skills, which probably shouldn't be a goal prior to endgame. In short, be very careful about how you use pickpocket, because you can easily put yourself behind the combat power curve. I fell into that trap with this build during my survival playthrough, so I learned that lesson firsthand and I regret it. So there we go. In summary, for what I would consider kind of an optimal endgame martial build, where you have diverse options in terms of ranged and melee, that's a grand total of 72 points. 5 into one-handed, 4 into light armor, 2 into block, 10 to archery, 12 to sneak, 7 to destruction, 5 to alteration. And then we have our 3 crafting skills, 11 into enchantment, 9 into smithing, 7 into alchemy. And all 3 of those crafting skills could hypothetically be refunded. Even if we only do enchantment and smithing, that's 20 points. So hypothetically, we could get there at character level 53 and have all this filled in. And I think that's going to be a wrap. As I've mentioned, I'm going to have an optimized series coming soon, which is going to go step by step through the game, collecting all of the best boons and bonuses to try to get us to the end game as quickly and efficiently as possible. And that's certainly going to include our end game crafting process, a guide on how to do that, as well as what our final enchantment setup should look like for a martial build. So I hope you'll join me for it. Also keep an eye out for my mage episode coming soon. Until then, thank you all so much. Please like and subscribe. This has been Honestman, and I'll see you next time with more Skyrim.